Okay, well, now let's talk about your book. First of all, what prompted you to do this book?
Well, Richard, it's a fairly long story, but what prompted me was a couple of friends and some people like Christopher Nicklin, who always said to me, you should do this into book form. And then about a year and a half ago, one of my colleagues at FMR, Vanessa Levenstein, who's our copywriter and who is a very feisty woman, I have to say, said, listen, she saw my archive of all these notes and she said, listen, you have to put this in book form. And I said, yes, 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 one day, one day, one day. And she was so insistent. She phoned Jonathan Ball. And I said, no, you can't possibly phone Jonathan Ball. You know, that's a very posh publisher. She phoned Jonathan Ball. They absolutely agreed to be interested in publishing it. And she sat on me like you won't believe, saying, okay, you know, this week you've got this many words to get in, next week you've got that many words, next week you've got that many words. And I have to say that it's thanks to Vanessa that the book actually became printed. But how initially, Richard, with the program notes, you will recall, Richard, years ago when you and I were at the SABC, one day you asked me to do a pre-concert talk. And I said to you, no, I couldn't possibly do that. And you said, no, give it a try. And I think it was Mahler 2, or it might have been the Sea Symphony by Vaughan Williams, where I had to address the choir.
It was the Sea Symphony, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you said, okay, well, why don't you do some notes? And I said, no, I can't. And then came this famous quote by you, Richard, where I'd been doing it for a while. You see you laughing because you know what's coming. I'd been doing it for a while. And Richard said to me, I said to Richard, I don't know why it's so popular. And Richard said, well, Rod, because you've got the common touch. And I was very offended. I really was offended because I thought this is now a reflection on my background and all the rest of it. But over the years, and thanks to Mary Rurich, of all people, I realized, Richard, that it was the best compliment you could have paid me. And this is the reason this book is not an academic book. It's not meant for universities at all. It's meant for us people, the man in the street, so they say, just to be able to enhance their enjoyment of a concert.
Well, I think that's a very good way of putting it all, because one of the things about music and things to do with music is being able to communicate. And I think that's what you've done beautifully in this book. And that's why I asked you originally to talk to the choir, actually. And one of my choir members reminded me of this, and he said, it was the Sea Symphony indeed. I asked you to come and talk to the choir about the Sea Symphony. And he wrote to me, funny enough, today, saying, I remember Rodney doing that talk, and he was very nervous, he said. But I bet you these days, yeah, but I bet you these days, when you do pre-concert talks, those nerves have gone. And I just want you to comment on this, that it's one thing to sit behind a microphone at a radio. It's another, well, where you're talking to thousands of people, but it's another to stand in front of 40, 50 people and talk to them. Tell us about that dynamic.
Well, it is, Richard, because one of the wonderful things about radio is, although you know you've got, I mean, we have 100,000 listeners or so on FMR, but they are kind of anonymous, and yet we know they are very much part of our infrastructure, and you don't see them. But the moment you see people, it creates quite a different, shall we say, environment, quite a different sense of what you're trying to do. And going to talk to people, 40 people, is much more nerve-wracking, for want of a better word, than talking on the radio, which has 100,000 listeners. Yet, they've also asked me over the years to do, and you know this, Richard, the mass concerts at Kirstenbosch, where there's 6,000 people. And people have said to me, aren't you terribly nervous? And no, because then that's different, because you tend to look at the people in the front row. And the fact that there are 6,000 people there doesn't really matter, because you're looking at a few faces smiling up at you in the front row. So, and you know, Richard, you know, the nerve thing goes away very quickly.
And I just, for the people who are tuned in here too, I just want to remind you, Rodney, that at one of those concerts at Kirstenbosch, I called you up to conduct the orchestra as well.
Oh dear, you did, and it was the Dam Busters March.
You mean the Dam Busters March?
The Dam Busters March. And I remember, because at that stage I was still at the SABC, and I was visiting Chris and Sarah Nicola in Cape Town, and we came along, and you called me, and I had to get all the way down to stage. And I remember, I think possibly you were more nervous than me, Richard, because you knew that I couldn't conduct. And it was this tricky introduction of the timpani, and you were standing on the side. But it worked brilliantly. And, you know, I've got a number of dates since then with the Berlin Philharmonic and the London Philharmonic, and, you know.
Now, Rod, just for the people who are listening also, this book, Concert Notes, is the result also of a commission which I gave Rodney initially to write program notes for our printed programs. So, Rod, just take us from the story that was in the days of the National Symphony Orchestra. Just take us through the story from those days to where you are now and to this book.
Well, that's the thing, Richard. You asked me to do those notes for the National Symphony Orchestra, which I did, and they coincided with pre-concert talks, which I did at the time for the National Symphony Orchestra, as it was then the erstwhile National Symphony Orchestra. And so I collected a bank of notes over the years of the notes that I'd written for the orchestra. And then when I moved to Cape Town to come to Fine Music Radio, I asked Louis Heinemann if I could do some pre-concert talks here and notes. And I was very lucky because there was not a vacancy in a sense that no one was writing concert notes. They were having to rehash the notes that had been written before. And I'm trying to think of the name, Richard, and you know who I'm thinking of, who used to write notes, and it's on the tip of my tongue. And also there were no Tony
Cunett.
Tony Cunett, yes. So they were using his notes, which to some extent they still use, but they asked me to do it, and they asked me to do pre-concert talks, which I did. So my archive, for want of a better word, grew and grew and grew. And this is what happened in the office one day when Vanessa Levenstein said to me, do you know anything about, I think it was Gershwin's Piano Concerto. And I pushed print on my computer and gave her my note. And she said, where did you get that from? And I said, I've got hundreds of them. And she came and looked and she said, Rodney, this has got to be a book. Now, as I said, Chris Nicklin also said, you've got to put this into book form. And so Vanessa, over the next year, was my, she got very cross because I said she was the biggest nag I've ever encountered in my life. And I really hope, Vanessa, you're not listening. But if it was not for Vanessa, I would never have knuckled down and done this. And there were other people who helped. We had this joke with David Langford of the orchestra trying to make me laugh when I was doing the interview. And we had Louise Howlett, who was who put all my notes together into a kind of special, because I'm not exactly a computer whiz. So all these people helped me enormously, Richard. And so it happened, and it was produced. And there it is. Look, I've even got one here myself. Someone bought it for me. I'm very grateful.
And one of the interesting parts of this is that you've written, at the beginning, you've written something called About This Book. And it's a sort of little compendium of music history, really, in very broad outline, just giving the various periods of music before you start on the actual notes. And then they're arranged alphabetically. And of course, some composers have more than others. But really, for me, it's a compendium, and it's a very interesting compendium of the sort of music which has been performed for the last 30 years, let's say, by certainly the orchestras in Johannesburg and Cape Town. So it's very middle of the road repertoire, I would say. Would you say that?
It is, Richard. You know, some people like you said, why is there not more Bach or Handel or Haydn, who's a great favorite of mine, Mahler, Bruckner, and the notes are based on the repertoire that our orchestras did in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And well, you can understand why there's not much Bruckner or Mahler, although I do have a couple of Mahler symphonies in there because of the size of the orchestra. But I've always been, I suppose, slightly sad that there's not more Haydn. And I have steered clear of the Baroque because the orchestras here, Richard, didn't really do much Baroque music. It was seldom that you'd go to a concert with the National Symphony Orchestra or the Cape Town Philharmonic and hear a Haydn organ concerto, a Handel organ concerto, or a Vivaldi flute concerto, or whatever.
Or even only occasionally we heard a Haydn symphony. Victor Yampolsky. Just let me tell you a story about Victor Yampolsky. He used to arrive here, and his first program, always, because most conductors, well, as the years went by, they stayed here about 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And he always put a Haydn symphony down in his first program, and he would stand up in front of the orchestra and say, because of the style that it's played in and the precision which you need for classical period music, he would say, ladies and gentlemen, the cleaning lady has arrived.
But that is true. That is so true, Richard. And it's always slightly irritated me that we all know what a genius Mozart was. I mean, it's laid into us all the time. But Haydn is the most extraordinary composer. He wrote 104 symphonies, and each symphony, anyone who says they're all the same really doesn't know what they're talking about. The element of, you know, Haydn said that he never got a chance to travel when he worked for the Esterházys, Prince at Esterházy Palace. So he had to be original. He famously said he had to be original. And gosh, was he original. And I long for more Haydn symphonies to be played. But there's a huge lack of Haydn symphonies in my book.
Yes. Sorry, he was in lockdown, you see. He was in lockdown at Esterházy.
He was actually. He was not allowed to travel. He was not allowed to travel until the prince died, and he went to London on 2 occasions. And you hear in his music and in the style of the orchestral playing how much those big London orchestras, which were bigger than the orchestra he had at his disposal at Esterházy, influenced him. Those symphonies from about 93 onwards are even more reason to believe that Haydn was an extraordinary composer. And I wish we had more Haydn.
Well, those are all the sort of facts that you can pick up from this book of Rodney's concert notes. But Rod, I want to know a little bit more about you. How did you get involved in music? Because you don't play an instrument now, but did you ever?
I played the flute, Richard. Famously, I learned the recorder when I was at high school. I had fairly modest parents who couldn't afford piano lessons, and I desperately wanted to learn the piano. So the first opportunity I had to learn the recorder, I did at high school. And then when I left, I learned the flute. But I had a friend, and this actually I put in the introduction to this book, who was learning the piano. And he used to practice after school. You know how at school you hated to stay after school, but I used to stay and listen to him practicing things on the piano. And he actually taught me quite a lot just by listening to him. And then I read a lot. I read a lot about the composers, and I listened a lot. I listened in the old days to the English service, to David Lloyd and Stephen O'Reilly and Midday Concert and those programs. And when I joined the SABC, okay, so yes, I learned the flute and played in the orchestra in Durban for about 2 years as a freelance musician. No,
was that in the municipal orchestra?
Yes, the Durban Municipal Orchestra. My teacher was John Hinch, who's now in Pretoria. And because the orchestra was having bad times financially, they didn't have a second flute. So he used to use me and another pupil of his called Diane Bell, who's now the librarian of the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic, to fill in on weekends or on Thursday evenings. at that stage, I worked in a record shop or a insurance company or whatever. And I got a taste of playing in an orchestra as a result of that. But I realized, Richard, and you would know this, I had started too late. I could never be a professional musician. So by joining the SABC, I thought this was a way to indulge my love of music by broadcasting.
And have you been regretting the fact that you were never a professional musician, or has it allowed you to do many other things?
It's allowed me to do many other things. I'm definitely not sad that I'm not a professional musician. As we know, professional musicians have all sorts of issues. I have to say, having had a taste of playing in the orchestra, I absolutely admire professional musicians, and I understand their frustrations with salaries, with mad conductors, and so on. But I'm very glad I didn't do that and I went the broadcasting way. Are you smiling because you're a mad conductor?
No. No, I'm smiling because when I think back to the days of the Durban Municipal Orchestra, when it shut down, and it shut down rather suddenly, I seem to remember.
Very suddenly, 1976.
It was lumped together with sort of sewage and waste disposal, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yeah. As a non-essential service, although I would have thought that sewage was an essential service.
Well, we hope so.
Yeah.
And okay, you touched there on broadcasting. So you went to work at the SABC and as a controller, a sound controller.
A sound engineer, yeah, that's how I started. But Richard, you know what? I was very lucky because I was able to work with the greats of the end of the great broadcasting era, the Paddy O'Byrnes, Christopher Bennett, Stephen O'Reilly, John Bolter, all these names that mean a lot to us, but might not mean a lot to a lot of other people. And what I did when I was a controller, I would sit and listen. I would listen. I was a great listener. So when they came in to package a program, I would look at how they did the script. Sometimes I'd sneak their script home to sort of see how they'd written the script. And I would talk to them and say, but why did you do this? Why did you do that? So I had a perfect training ground.
And you know, when I went to Johannesburg, when I came to Johannesburg, which was in 1980, I wasn't initially employed as a broadcaster, but I got on very well with David Lloyd. I don't know if you remember
Yes.
David Lloyd.
I remember he was the one that gave me my big break, Richard.
Oh, really?
David,
well, I used to sit on his packaging sessions, and again, just for the people who are listening to this program, it was amazing to see how he put a program together. He would fake the applause. He would fake all sorts of things, but he was very clever about how he put the program together.
Yes, it was called Concert Hall. It was broadcast at 3:00 on a Sunday afternoon, and he pretended it was a live symphony concert with audience sounds, with the orchestra tuning and all that.
But it was all fake, really.
It was all fake, absolutely fake, yeah.
But it was beautifully done.
Absolutely it was. He was an absolute professional, and he had in his mind that he wanted to create this sense of a live symphony concert on a Sunday afternoon. And it worked incredibly well. And for some years, some time, I was his engineer helping him to fake it, as it were. As it were.
So,
the only person I've ever helped to fake it.
So all of this background to your music life and your broadcasting life has led you to a different place now where you produced this book. And again, for the people who are listening, just tell us the sort of thing that they might find here. Will they find, for example, I know you're a great Beethoven fan.
Yes.
Is there lots of Beethoven in here?
Well, Richard, that's as a result of what I said earlier. There is a lot of Beethoven. There's a lot of Mozart. There's a lot of Tchaikovsky, because these are the works that are performed most frequently by our orchestras. But there is surprisingly little Haydn, Mahler, Handel, Bach, for example. And I think the reason, and Richard, you'd be able to, the reason our orchestras don't play much Bach is because it's for stylistic reasons.
Yes, it's a specialist thing now.
It's a specialist thing. So this book is meant to be a handbook. It's not an academic book, as I said. It's not a university book. It's just for someone to think, oh, okay, tomorrow night I'm going to hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Mozart's Piano Concerto number 21. And let's see what Rodney has to say about it. And just to give them some kind of, I don't know, signposts to the piece, or sitting at home listening on CDs, although most CDs have very comprehensive program notes. But it really is designed to enhance the man in the street's enjoyment of classical music, because I am not a classical music academic. So if you ask me to analyze Beethoven's Fifth Symphony harmonically, I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know where to start. But I am passionate about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and I understand its structure and its process from C minor to C major. And this is what I try and get across in the book in a way that people can understand. Because, Richard, you of all people also know that classical music is there for everybody to enjoy.
Absolutely. And I've spent my whole life really trying to make classical music more accessible to people. That's been my job in life. Yeah. Now, I just want to say before we go any further that if anyone has a question that they would like to put to Rodney or to myself, if you want to type it into the Zoom group chat, you can, and we will try to answer those questions as we go along. I just asked you, Rodney, about the fact that there was lots of Beethoven here. But sadly for you, your other great love in life is Richard Wagner.
Yes.
And unfortunately, he didn't write a lot of purely orchestral music. So, I mean, the only thing that I can think of that I ever scheduled in a concert was the Siegfried Idyll, or maybe the Faust Overture, and some of those overtures that have been played. But all of them, of course, require massive orchestras. So it was not always so easy to schedule them. Just give us an insight into that.
Well, that's the thing, Richard. I mean, those like that Faust Overture is very early Wagner, and is nothing like the Wagner we know. Or even he wrote a symphony, some bizarre reason he wrote a symphony, very much influenced by Beethoven. But sometimes, and I think I remember in Johannesburg, Richard, and maybe you went there, they did excerpts from The Ring. They did the Siegfried Funeral March or the Rhine Journey, those big orchestral showpieces. But no, it's not. It is a great, Wagner is second only to Beethoven for me. And in fact, I have to say that during this lockdown, I have been listening to the Ring Cycle, the Schulte Ring Cycle, which I hadn't heard for years, because I have so many Ring Cycles that, the Ring Cycle is not something you can knock off in a day or two. So I've been listening to the Ring Cycle and just so, amazed anew at this extraordinary composer, especially with the Ring, where so much is interrelated. And the Ring you can think of as a huge symphony in 4 movements. The first movement, where a number of themes are introduced and developed. The second movement, Walküre, a kind of slow lyrical movement. The third movement, a scherzo, Siegfried, where themes and leitmotifs come back, and then the great finale, Götterdämmerung. It is an extraordinary achievement, and I've seen it live 4 times. I'm very lucky to have seen it, including at Bayreuth. But in this book, I managed, I think, 1 Wagner insert, and that was excerpts from The Ring, the famous orchestral excerpts that people do, the Rhine Journey, the Funeral March, and whatever. It was, and the Ride of the Valkyries, which they often do without the singers.
Well, I'm happy to tell you that during lockdown, because lockdown has obviously been a positive experience for you. You've had time to do things that you might not otherwise have done. But it's been very profitable for me also, because Sue and I have also watched a Wagner opera, which is
Richard,
no, I know, so daring, so daring.
Which one?
It was Lohengrin.
Good heavens, how daring of you, Richard.
I know. It's quite wonderful. And there's good. Somebody's put up a message now, which I will read in a moment. But also, just to give you a question, Rod, for example, I've always been amazed by your knowledge of music. And I know you listen to a lot of music. And just to give us an idea, how many different recordings of Beethoven 9 do you have?
You see, that's a trick question, Richard, because you know that that's my obsession. I am, I think, a little bit of an obsessive compulsive person. And I remember when I was in matric, I went to hear Beethoven 9. I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard it in my life before. And there was a conductor called Alfred Walter who ended his career recording Strauss waltzes for Naxos. Can you believe it? And he worked with Knappitzbusch at Bayreuth. And there was this evening where in the first half, which was very short, he played the Parsifal Prelude. And then in the second half, Parsifal the Wagner Prelude. And in the second half, Beethoven 9. And my life changed. It was a Thursday night, school the next day. It had an extraordinary impact on me. And now I have, well, at last count, I have 54 recordings of Beethoven's Ninth, but also I have a number of recordings of the Beethoven symphonies, because Richard, you know that they are the cornerstone of the symphonic repertoire, those 9 symphonies. And I was lucky to hear them all in Berlin recently. But the ninth is very special to me. And you might say to me, which is your favorite? Impossible to say.
Okay, but the question that's come up on the screen, Rod, is a very nice one. It says, hello,
Good.
Richard and Rodney, enjoying your conversation. And we've got a question. If you could attend a live symphony concert later tonight, what would your ideal program be if it were sort of standard overture, concerto, symphony?
And I must answer that.
Well, let's chat about it.
Well, Richard, obviously it's taste.
Yes, but let's talk about duration. Say the overture is 10 minutes. The concerto could be between 20 and 30, and the symphony could be anything up to 40. So let's take a nice overture of 10 minutes.
Okay, but then the other thing, Richard, is how big is the orchestra that evening? Because I would say the overture must be Die Meistersinger by Wagner. The concerto should be a Mozart piano concerto, maybe number 23, the A major one, K488, which is such a favorite. And the symphony, you might be surprised to hear because it's a huge favorite of mine. And I've just been listening in view of this concert, this imaginary concert, would be Dvorak 7, the D minor Dvorak symphony, which I think is Dvorak's masterpiece.
And not often played.
No, it's not often played, but I believe it's very tricky. So Meistersinger, maybe that's too big. Mozart 23 and Dvorak 7.
Okay, good.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking about what mine would be. But there's another question here. It says here, as both of us have made classical music more accessible to every man, have you noticed more young people gravitating towards classical music? Now, you go to concerts regularly in Cape Town, so give us an answer to that.
I definitely think so. I definitely think so. And I think, Richard, you will agree. And I'm talking about the mainstream symphony concerts, not the, these Viennese balls and things. I'm talking about the mainstream symphony concerts. Certainly in Cape Town, we get a jolly good selection of young people there.
Yeah, and I think audiences are changing here too.
Yeah.
And I think the demographic of audiences is changing also. Not only old and young, but in terms of cultural diversity.
Absolutely. Across the races, Richard, I think now more than ever before, we have the different races enjoying music here in Cape Town. So I'm very positive about that.
And several people have said Wagner, Mozart, and Dvorak, excellent, thank you.
Good, good, good. The perfect.
Have you ever had an opportunity to choose a program for the orchestra to play?
No, Richard, no. Because as you know, that's done by the artistic directors of the orchestras. So no, I've never been able to do that. I've often thought, why don't they do this, this, and this? But I haven't had that opportunity.
You could always suggest it, of course.
Yes, I could. I could.
Now, Rod, have you thought that this book might be useful as an audio book for people to listen to? Because, for example, what we're doing now, if people wanted to click on and say, I'd like to hear what Rodney Trudgeon says about Francis Poulenc, for example. I've just opened it at that page.
Who? Richard, Jonathan Ball, the publishers of this book, and Vanessa Levenstein, who has helped me so immeasurably in the book, have both suggested that we do a audio book. Now, Jonathan Ball has various readers because of the professional aspect who read their books. But we both said, if this book becomes an audiobook, obviously I need to read it. I'd have to do it in my voice. So there is that possibility. There's that possibility. There's also a possibility that it might be translated into Afrikaans. Or Xhosa.
Or Hindustani, or
something else.
Maybe
not Hindustani. No, maybe not Hindustani.
No, but it could be translated, but that's going to be a massive task for somebody.
Yes.
Because I think the sort of music that's you've written about in here is sort of widely acceptable to a very wide-ranging public.
It is. Richard, this, as you know so well, for a long time, you were the manager of the orchestra in Johannesburg and responsible for programs and things. And this book consists of the central basic repertoire that I'm trying to...
The core repertoire.
That bit more. Sorry?
Yes. I was going to say the core repertoire.
Well, the core repertoire. I prefer central basic, but never mind.
Yes, the basic repertoire. But I'm looking now to see whether there are any other questions. Various people are saying, thank you for the wonderful conversation. I was wondering whether you could predict, what the post-COVID-19 orchestra scene in South Africa would look like. Now, before you answer that, and I will say something about it too, I'm very much looking forward to the lockdown being lifted. But what I'm worried about is that people will be nervous about going to large gatherings to start with. So I think we're going to have a slow start. And what worries me is that musicians, certainly all the musicians I know in Johannesburg, we don't have a full-time contracted orchestra here. They're all freelance. Many of the musicians have really been suffering because suddenly they had no income. I mean, myself included. All my concerts were cancelled from the end of March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. I've had 7 months worth of concerts cancelled now. And it's a very serious impact on me and on the players, because being freelance players, some of them can teach online, and many of them do that. But as far as their playing goes, they will have had 7 months of no income from playing. And not only will that affect their income, but affect their playing also, because it's hard to practice for 7 months with nothing to let it out on, as it were. So and it's not only here. I was just reading an article today where Simon Rattle was saying he's really worried about his orchestra. The Albert Hall, the Royal Festival Hall, are really worried about their futures because, for a start, their income depends greatly on audiences, much more than on the continent, for example. In Germany and Austria, the orchestras and the opera companies are about 80% subsidized by the state. In Britain, the story is very different, and here the story is even more different. So it is a very worrying factor. I think there are several orchestras around the world that are going to go to the wall. And it is very worrying about the future, because people will have gone to the wall here too, I'm sorry to say. Have you got a feeling about that?
Well, Richard, yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, I agree with you. But, at Fine Music Radio, we're trying to keep the interest level up. There's a program called Play On, which happens once a week on a Monday, where we're trying to give local artists a chance to perform. And now the Cape Town Philharmonic has come up with a little competition that we're running each week. And we're going to be broadcasting some Cape Town Philharmonic concerts. But it's not the same, is it, Richard, as a concert in the Cape Town City Hall where people come in. But what we want to do at Fine Music Radio is keep an awareness that these people, as Play On does, are out of work and they're playing for us on air. So we're trying our best to keep local artists and the orchestra in people's minds.
Yeah, and for example, the Brooklyn Theatre in Pretoria have started a sort of online TV channel, in inverted commas, where people can perform. But the sort of income you can get from that is limited. I mean, it's something at least, because that's what we need, is some sort of income at the moment for musicians, because many of them are really struggling.
And I think as well, and congratulations to Mary Fora, Richard, for the Fine Arts Festival, because all this was meant to be happening at the Fine Arts Festival now. And they've taken the bull by the horns, or whatever the expression is, and got these online interviews and presentations. So people have been very resourceful, and which is great, but it's not the same. And we cannot, people, as you say, people ask us what the future is. We simply don't know.
Just so that we know, it's published by Jonathan Ball, and I paid 247 South African rands for this book at Exclusive Books.
Is that all?
Of course, it's worth a whole fortune more than that.
Absolutely.
And it's not even signed. I'm waiting for it to be signed.
Oh, dear. Well, that'll increase the value immeasurably.
Yes, I'll bring it to Cape Town when I'm next there, and you can sign it for me. And it's also got a foreword by a very distinguished conductor from Johannesburg.
Ah, yes. What's his name? It'll come to me in a moment.
Yeah, there was a funny story about this too, I must tell you, the people who are listening, that Rodney or somebody wanted to get Simon, was it Simon Rattle?
She wanted to get Simon Rattle or Daniel Barenboim, and I said, don't be ridiculous. They won't want to do this. Let's get some local yokel.
So you got the next best thing.
But Richard, the fact that you did the foreword means a lot to me because of your association with music in Cape Town. So I was thrilled when you agreed to do it.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's on the program.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. It's great to see you, great to share this with you. And I'm very happy to have been able to interview Rodney, my dear old friend.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Until the next time, from myself, Richard Cock, and from Rodney, I just want to say thank you to Mary, and we hope you have a fantastic Fine Arts Select Festival.